last have all the coffee. You know, I've been meaning to do a follow-up video on the missing king one because a lot flies over the heads of the Americans, and yes, I'm fully aware I'm alienating a lot of people with my pretentiousness. That is what we do here. And yes, I'm also fully aware your country's founding was at a time of absolute monarchs, and therefore you cling with a great sentimentality to your constitutional republic, and that by presenting monarchy to you, it does cause this visceral compulsion of rejection, because to embrace a monarch would be to attack the very essence of what it means to be an American. However, I am bold and therefore I do not care. Americans need to realize a couple of things about its history and government. If you've taken a look at history and you consider revolution the establishment of a new type of government, America's had 3 governments and 2 revolutions. Monarchy under the rule of King George III, which led to the American Revolution and the Articles of Confederation, and then about 12 years later, the secret plot to establish the US Constitution. Now, I've played this before, but it bears repeating.
But what, of course, we forget is that our glorious Constitution, as established in 1789, is established in a reactionary coup. Not only is the Constitution a reactionary coup basically orchestrated by George Washington and his friends, a very monarchical individual, one of the things you'll notice is basically the first, you probably can name, the first American Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. That the period of basically the Congress of the Confederation totally airbrushed out of history. Do you know who America's first president was? It was John Hanson, the president of the Congress. And the results of that system were so disastrous, and the results of that system were identified by people like John Adams, literally with democracy. And, basically, there was just period of, they were just like, this is a shit show. We have to establish basically responsible aristocratic government. We have to replace democracy with oligarchy. And so we're going to run this constitutional convention thing.
But you like that part?
Well, I mean, that part was, that part was an improvement in that situation. Certainly the new republic was very much an aristocratic republic, and, it managed to subsist.
The men who gather in Philadelphia were also willing to ignore their instructions to revise and amend the Articles of Confederation, and instead they decided to come up with an entirely new frame of government, one that they devised in secret sessions with locked doors and windows, despite the summer heat. One can argue that in some ways what you had here was a coup.
Now, the reason I played that is because someone previously mentioned not favoring centralized power and a preference for this mythical fantasy of a phrase, limited government. All government is absolute, for a start. There is no such thing as limited government. That is a mythology. Secondly, your US Constitution was established as part of a reactionary coup, putting forth centralized government by an oligarchy, which gave the new government of the United States more power than King George III ever had. So well done indeed. You rejected monarchy and democracy, and you embraced oligarchy. Well, technically speaking, you sort of embraced a version of all 3, really, but America's US constitutional government is an oligarchical creation. Now, I favor the absolute monarch. To quote Curtis Yarvin, divine right monarchy is very easy to understand, even for an atheist like me. We have already derived it. To an atheist, the king's authority must be absolute, not because he's appointed by God, but because he's appointed by no one. If someone appoints him, that man is king. If their roles are divided, the famous balance of powers or checks and balances, they will struggle, and one or the other prevail, probably the many over the few. Thus we see high tempers and fisticuffs in the chambers of state. The mice must be governed by the elephants, but all this trumpeting and trunk lashing alarms them. What if they begin to stomp? As imperium decays, the state becomes conflicted and incompetent, incapable of making good decisions or any at all. And at worst, of course, it actually fights itself. Thus, the modern divine right monarchist says not that God has chosen any person or family to rule, but that sovereignty exists and someone must hold it. The more narrowly and stably held the imperium is, the safer it is. The emphasis on stability is essential because this answers the question we asked earlier: the difference between Hitler and King Louis XIV. The difference is that the famous dictatorships of the 20th century were not stable royal dynasties or anything close. They rested entirely on the personal position of the dictator, whose absolute authority concealed contending factions at all times and could at any time have shattered into those factions. If the mere death of a single human being, for instance, can result in regime change, a regime cannot be regarded as stable. It thus exists in a state of permanent, if suspended, civil war. This is very far from Filmer. Robert Filmer, by the way, English defender of the divine right of kings. Do read his work Patriarcha, and it can quite reasonably be expected to result in a gruesome variety of tyrannous manifestations, as of course was seen in the 20th century. That point right there, someone must hold it. This misplaced fear of centralized power is based on Lord Acton's quote, "Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely." This is not true. Absolute power does not corrupt. Idiots, on the other hand, do corrupt power. And this is the more logical conclusion, by the way, because everyone says, oh, if the king is great, excellent. If the king is bad or corrupt, we're screwed. Would that person be bad and corrupt in any position of power? Yes. So then it's not power corrupting them, it's that they themselves, the individual, are unfit to wield any sort of power. Which in America doesn't really matter either way because your power is already centralized, in theory anyway. I've mentioned this previously as well. Balance of power does not factor in the scale of the balance. You can have a balance on paper of say 10 in each branch, for example, but if the branch scales to 100 in each branch, you still have said balance on paper, but the scale itself is now 10 times bigger, i.e. the growth of the state. So what you need to do, if you're going to analyze this objectively, is divorce yourself from the US Constitution. Otherwise, you're going to view it with this rose-tinted set of eyes and feelings will cloud your judgment, and most importantly, we are not women. And if you think this task is a great offense to your founding fathers, ask yourself a simple question. If they were alive today, and you showed them the state of the US government, and you said you want to dismantle this system, do you think they would stop you or help you? Take a moment to process that. Hamilton would have a field day if he saw the state of the government today, I mean, my word. Don't bother with how it's supposed to function. We're dealing with what we're objectively seeing with regards to state operations. So perform a simple diagnosis. What do you see? Do the people actually have any say about anything that goes on in government? No. The people have no control over the government whatsoever. The party system is a complete joke. Why? Because both sides are corrupted, one with money, the other one with power. This occurs before the ballot is even cast, because the corruption is what allows them to get on the ballot to begin with. Logically then, voting is but the means to an end, to get them into power, and for the population to enjoy this psychological feeling of wielding power and mattering, but this is all just largely ceremonial. Like I said before, voting does not remove the corruption, only the corrupted. Voting does not interface with the corruption of this process. Voting only concerns itself with the final stage of the corruption process, not at the root cause of the problem. You're changing the employees, not the management. Now, the reason I mention this again is because the main thing that scares every Yank witless is this weird fear the monarch might be bad, and they're petrified they can't use democracy to get rid of him. Yet in their own government, they don't actually interface with the oligarchical corruption either. Do you see the point I'm trying to make here? This is what people need to understand. There is no such thing as solutions, you have only trade-offs. The trade-off of decentralization is that you open the system up for corruption from every angle, and if you outsource the accountability, then you wind up with the system that you have now, where you have neither. You have centralization on paper, but not really. The great power of the government is influenced from outside its walls, sure as hell not in a democratic way either. And the decentralization is what disperses power over this huge network that makes up this enormous bureaucracy, hence its accountability for the real abuses of power is basically none. Again, look at the current administration. What you lack in the democratic apparatus is the representation has no stake in the game because they are the will of the people, and there is no collective will of the people. Politicians merely exist as representatives of a faction war, playing for the spoils of the people, which they then claim to spend on their behalf, which is just a ruse to buy votes, a sort of bastardized version of Robin Hood. Where does the prestige and influence lie in the American government? The New York Times, Washington Post, for example. They sell state information in what Curtis calls tolerated illegality, not to mention academia and NGOs. None of those entities are even mentioned in the US Constitution, which means the most powerful organs of power apparatus isn't even connected to the US government at all. Your government only exists on paper, and in the US that is quite literal. As Pastor Louis said, the US Constitution is just a piece of fucking paper. There is a reason I put that quote by Lysander Spooner in the last video, so here's 2 more for you. Our constitutions purport to be established by the people, and in theory, all the people consent to such government as the constitutions authorize. But this consent of the people exists only in theory. It has no existence in fact. Government is in reality established by the few, and these few assume the consent of all the rest, without any such consent being actually given. A man is no less a slave because he's allowed to choose a new master once in a term of years. So you have this connected but not officially part of the state organs that make up this enormous bulk of influence in the power apparatus Mulbach calls the cathedral. Hypothetically, if Trump were to take power now and he decided to be whimsical and ever so slightly more ruthless than his first term, a la go a bit Caesar-esque, shall we say, he would immediately start dismantling government left, right, and freaking center. Why? Because it's far too big for one person to rule. The level of loyalty required for such a massive apparatus would be an enormous waste of resources. Not to mention the level of corruption would damn near guarantee a demolition, not a reformation. There'd be far too many avenues for challenging his reign, and we're concerned with getting and holding power. And this fee would hopefully not have this absurd level of violence that exists only in people's minds. This is not the French Revolution's era. This is the 21st century, and we are far less violent. You'd essentially be trying to pull off rage, retire all government employees. Much like the Stasi were brought down. Simply march into the offices, thank you for your services, you're done, exit at the end of the hall, turn off the political activation, and go about your business. Cheers for watching, and once again, I apologize for nothing.